Dr. Mark Lewis. I'm the Executive Director of NDIA's Emerging Technologies Institute, and welcome to this edition of Technology Horizons. My guest today is an individual who certainly needs no introduction within the defense industrial community, and that is Craig Mundie. And Craig right now is the president of Mundie and Associates. It's an organization that counsels CEOs on strategic issues, focusing on rapidly evolving information technologies. And that's everything from corporate and technology strategies to techno-geopolitics, cybersecurity, and R&D management. I think Craig is best known for his work at Microsoft. He had a 22-year career there. During that time, he served as a senior advisor to the CEO, Chief Research and Strategy Officer starting in 2007. His responsibilities included oversight of Microsoft research, intellectual property strategy, technology policy, trustworthy computing, and various technology and product incubation activities. Also, for the past 15 years, Craig was Microsoft's principal technology policy liaison to many governments worldwide, and really a special emphasis on China as well. So that may be an interesting part of our conversation today. Craig has spent his entire career working with startup activities, spanning some really diverse fields: software, mini computing, supercomputing, consumer electronics, and healthcare. He originally joined Microsoft to develop non-PC software platform technologies after he departed as CEO from Alliant Computer Systems, which he co-founded in 1982 and took public in 1987. Craig serves on the boards of directors for a number of companies, including in the healthcare sector. He's on advisory boards for also a long list of companies. I first got to meet Craig when I was involved in organizations that supported the President's Council of Advisors in Science Technology, and Craig was appointed to that organization, PCAST, in 2009. And has continued to serve. And I can say one of the pleasures of my role, I ran the organization that did the research support to the Office of Science Technology Policy. So I got to sit in on all the PCAST meetings, and it was always a pleasure to listen to Craig and benefit from his wisdom as he was providing the input to the White House. So again, Craig, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Mark, it's good to be here. Thank you.
So, if I can, I wanted to dive right in. You've had a long history of working with both the national security community, commercial industry, the intelligence community, but also the university community. And those communities have put a lot of effort in trying to connect the Pentagon and the intelligence community to Silicon Valley. And could you tell us your assessment of how that has worked, what has worked, what hasn't worked, and how we could go forward in the future?
Well, I think it's labored against that goal and has not been super successful. I think as time goes on, it's been forced, the defense industrial base broadly and the key agencies in the government have been forced to look harder for a way to collaborate with the businesses and universities in these other areas, simply because a higher and higher percentage of the inventions, are coming from either around the world or outside the investment, that the government has often made for defense purposes. And so I think that there's an inversion in the way many important, or I'll say things that are national security interests, have evolved. In the past, many things were developed for defense purposes through defense funding and things like DARPA and government contracts in the universities. But as a percentage of all the funding that people get these days, a smaller and smaller percentage of that comes from that. I think one of the other things that's challenging is the world has become more globalized. The broad academic enterprise is pretty globalized. Hopefully it'll stay that way, although it's been a little more challenging in the last few years. But that also has created a problem for people in the defense, intelligence, and security sectors, because those people all aren't U.S. citizens. And so one of the things that characterizes the defense industrial base is they're all U.S. citizens. And, so it's a very homogeneous group of people for the most part. And there's a necessary separation between what happens in that environment and what happens in the much more open environment. This is particularly problematic at times. I mean, one of the things that I started at Microsoft, and the one thing I still actively work on with them, is quantum computing. And this is a very long-term research effort. But when Microsoft assembled its program, strictly out of its own funding and without either government funding on the academic side or on the defense side, we ended up with labs in 7 different countries because we went to hire the best people who were experts in these key underpinning disciplines. And that's easy as a multinational company to do, but it's very difficult if you're the defense industrial base to do. And so at a time where the U.S. has struggled really since 9/11 to continue to attract the world's smartest people, to not just to come to school here, but to stay here and even become citizens here, that has further constrained this. And so I think it's going to continue to be a challenge to get these to come together.
I couldn't agree more. I've often observed that, well, the United States has about 5% of the world's population. So to first order, I'd say we only have about 5% of smart people.
If you assume that,
so we need to leverage the rest of the
people
world.
are evenly distributed in the gene pool, then if you look at India or China, just by the numbers, then for every super smart person that grew up here, there's 5 of them there. And the question is, they may not yield as many of them because of other constraints, but those constraints are being eliminated as academic capability increases and the ability to use technology to identify all those people within a very large population gets better and better too. So I think the U.S. is seeing that, and as we've become less attractive for those people to come here, or less necessary for them to either come here or stay here, I think it's definitely going to crimp the ability for particularly the U.S. government and the defense base here to attract those people.
Yeah, I would often encounter people in the defense community, and as I say, well-meaning, patriotic Americans whose solution to some of our issues is, shut the doors, close the gates, don't let foreign students, for example, in the U.S. And my own take on it was that would be a dreadful idea. The time we need to worry is when they stop coming, not when they.
But it's been more than 20 years since we sort of closed the gates quite a bit, and then as the issues with China and the intellectual property issues got bigger and bigger, and of course now you have this catastrophe with Russia and Ukraine and sort of the geopolitics around that. I think that it's going to get harder, not easier.
Yeah, agreed. Without maybe calling out specific names, but the department has made various attempts to reach out to the broader research community. Organizations like the Defense Innovation Unit, AFWorks, for example. Each of the services is making efforts. Any sense of on those activities? What's worked? What hasn't worked?
I'm not really too good a commentator on those because a lot of that has really started to get some momentum or investment since the time where I left Microsoft on a full-time basis, which is 8 years ago, and so my own personal intersection with a lot of those programs is very limited. So I can't tell you I think it's working well or not working well, but I think it still always will struggle to overcome the things we just talked about, which is the desire, to control. Companies that make big investments in these things oftentimes worry that if the U.S. government interest decides it's super important, that they'll want to somehow constrain the ability of those companies to use it commercially. And I think that that tension between commercial applications and international deployments and U.S. applications. You see this in many areas of computing in general, whether it's image recognition or high-performance computing. I mean, the list is almost endless now, where everything is dual use. That's one of the speeches that I give to people, is that, a huge percentage of things that start life in the commercial sector suddenly people realize are dual use. But dual use used to mean exactly the opposite. It's something that was invented in the defense sector, and then we let it trickle down, in a controlled way
Yeah.
into commercial applications or international usage. And this, I think, is one of the biggest challenges that the U.S. and all the countries face, which is with more and more of the invention of things that are important to national security being invented in the private sector. Then how do you deal with that relationship? It's sort of like the horses are out of the barn by the time you recognize, oh my goodness, these really make an important difference in the way we think about national security.
Yeah, absolutely. A question I would frequently be asked when I was in the Pentagon, we'd have a couple companies, want to sell things to the department, but they point out we would be a very tiny fraction of their market. And if they sold to us, does it get slapped with an ITAR label and they can no longer sell to their major customers? And so that was, a concern that I kept running across.
And I think that is going to be an escalating concern, not a reducing concern.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. If I can switch gears a little bit, you mentioned your work on quantum, and I'm wondering, could you sort of tell us what's your vision for the promise of quantum computing, not only for the commercial world but also for the Department of Defense and maybe the intelligence community?
I think the first thing I'll say is that right now there's a huge amount of hype about quantum computing and a lot of funding going in. Yeah, and in my opinion, most people are poorly informed about what the genuine applications and benefits of quantum computers are likely to be. I do think that it's going to be an incredibly important technology, um, but I'll say, maybe let's just say there's three things we're pretty sure it's good at. All right,
Hmm.
it could be good at cracking codes if they're the classical kind of RSA type codes. Um, it can be good at certain types of low level chemical modeling things that are computationally difficult. And the same is true for some issues around material science. But if you read the literature and you look at what a lot of companies are promising, it ranges from balancing your portfolio risk if you're a bank to just the artificial intelligence and other things. And I'd say I'm personally and I think my colleagues at Microsoft are much more skeptical about whether we're going to see real application in those other areas. And I think the other big issue is most people have pretty significantly underestimated how big a quantum computer, in terms of number of physical qubits that'll be required, how big those machines are going to have to be to get into the realm of doing useful work. And it's why even now, 16 years ago, when Microsoft's program was started, we took an unorthodox approach, which was to look for a completely novel form of qubit, because we were even then worried about scaling. If you look at it right now, most places are focused on taking a qubit they understand and just trying to make it work better. But none of those seem to have a lot of promise toward building a really large scale machine. So I think there's a lot of work yet to be done. But even if it turned out it only worked for the three things I mentioned, the world is going to have to come to grips with the implications for current encryption. And what that really means is we need an accelerated transition to post-quantum cryptography. And we started the work on that at Microsoft and other places 10 years ago, and we're down to NIST selecting a few finalist candidates in the next year or so. I personally think that that needs to be accelerated, and I think that this is something that the defense sector needs to really focus on. If you look at how much effort is taken, and I know because I remember doing it at Microsoft, when we had to change the previous encryption standards, and purge all the old ones, it's a significant effort, and that was years ago, and now it's going to be even more difficult. We have more devices that are all connected that are not readily maintained, for example. and a lot of data that's now been collected, that there's no real good practice for going back and re-encrypting it in some way to protect it. So I think these are areas that the national security sector really needs to focus more on in the short term. Even though the quantum computers haven't arrived yet, you're going to have to do these protection steps earlier to be safe. I think if the other two things come to pass, though, it represents a huge opportunity, because almost everything that mankind, does and has done over the years is we build stuff and then we benefit from what we build. And if we can have designer chemicals and designer materials, I think it represents an opportunity to redo everything that we've ever done from as a society in building things. And whether the purpose of that is to, make things so that they, are more friendly from a climate point of view, or solve climate problems more directly. In the end, if you can reduce it to a chemistry problem, or like a catalysis problem, or to some type of special materials problem, then I think that's where the real impact of these machines is going to be felt. And of course, that would imply a lot of opportunity in the defense sector.
Yeah, absolutely. The question I always wonder about cryptography is, I think, as I very much agree with you, that can have an impact on existing codes, but if we're clever, we come up with cryptographic schemes that are no longer easily breakable. Of course, our adversaries are going to be doing the same thing. It seems to me we've got this narrow window where yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of why I don't think that the cryptography thing is going to be the big thing, because the people who are paying attention will take steps early to prevent it. I mean, it reminds me back of the old Y2K problem, where the dates didn't roll over correctly because most people just encoded them as 2 digits, because they didn't think about, oh my goodness, when the millennium rolls over, or the century rolls over, what happens now? But the whole world got focused on that, and patches were applied, and it was a non-event. I think this is like that on steroids. There's just a lot more residue of decades now of encrypting things and now storing them at scale, and that was never possible before. So I do think it's a real challenge, but at the end of the day, I think there will be post-quantum cryptography. I don't know whether even calling it post-quantum is the right thing to do or not. I mean, I don't know myself that any of these things have ever yet been proven to be uncrackable by a quantum computer at some arbitrary scale. But it doesn't matter, because cryptography is all about a work factor. You're just trying to make it take long enough or require a big enough machine that it doesn't happen at the drop of a hat, on every single thing. And it's pretty clear that we can increase the work factor, even for a quantum computer, substantially, and buy ourselves some time. How much time? We don't know. But I think we need to start buying that time and thinking about the things, whether it's commercial, or trade secret, or national security information, how that stuff gets assessed and safeguarded again. And determine whether or not there's any chance it was pilfered. I mean, one of the problems of so much stuff being recorded and high bandwidth interconnections is when bad guys come and borrow your data, they don't give it back for re-encryption later.
Right.
And so you really have to be very careful to think through what's lost already, and it's just a question of when the cryptographic facilities exist to decode that, and then thinking about what the implication of those losses are. I don't think it's that different than issues that people in the military or the Pentagon or defense sector have always had to think about, which is, when I have an asset, and I try to protect it, but I lose it, what are the implications of losing it? If I have a fancy airplane and I fly it in hostile environments, and then I try to, create a way to destroy it so that it doesn't get captured. Sometimes that doesn't work, and
Yeah.
your precious asset gets lost. And so I don't think this is that different. It's just going to happen at a bigger scale.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm kind of given your work looking frankly internationally. Um, what's your assessment? Where do you think the United States is compared to our peer competitors and potential adversaries in the quantum area?
Oh, in quantum, I still think that the U.S. is the leader in quantum in terms of, at least if you count the number of programs that are investing substantially, to get there. Of course, whatever the government's doing itself in this regard is opaque to me and everybody else at this point. Uh, but uh, but I think that the U.S. programs, at least on the commercial side, are world leading. Now that said, many other governments want to try to clone this kind of work. I mean, obviously China has made a very public commitment to the importance of quantum, all the way up to the, to the president, and they are putting a lot of money toward it. But I still see most of their work as derivative of stuff that was done in the West writ large, not just in the United States. And when that changes, it's very hard to predict. But I think right now the U.S. still probably has a lead.
And making sure we maintain that lead was one of the reasons that our Emerging Technologies Institute is very much focused on quantum as well as one of our main topics. So let me switch gears a little bit again. So I know you've thought a lot about America's economic future, the implications of information technology in that. What are your thoughts on what we need to do as a nation to make sure that we continue to lead in information technologies writ large?
Well, I think the most profound change that's coming, in computation is the emergence of artificial intelligence at hyperscale. One of the companies I'm involved with, is sort of Microsoft and OpenAI in that regard, and they're one of the few places in the world that really has a focus on artificial general intelligence. So here the goal is not just to build bigger and bigger machine learning models, which I think is what most people end up calling AI these days, but to actually build machines that are generally intelligent. And it's hard to tell at what rate that's going to happen, but I'm personally quite optimistic that it is going to happen, and probably happen at a speed that surprises people. As that occurs, I think, and even what we see happening these days with the few very, very large models, it just shows that the ability for machines to make discoveries, even in scientific terms, that have eluded humans, I think is clearly in the cards. And this is one of the things I don't think most people have really stopped to think about. Almost all the things we've done with computing vis-a-vis, I'll say, science and engineering in the past, was to just create a tool that helped humans make discoveries or do better designs, or investigate certain problems. But they were always tools to help the human. I think for the first time we're getting to the point, even now, where we can train polymathic machines in specific combinations of domains, and that those machines, in their ability to both ingest detailed information and to make decisions or discoveries across those domains, integrating across those domains, hence the polymathic idea, it exceeds what humans can do. And that time is actually now. It's not some dreamy thing in the future. But when you get to that point, it forces an inversion in the relationship of the humans to the machines in terms of the pursuit of whatever the question is. So whether you're trying to make a scientific discovery in biology or physics, I think you can see this, for example, in the work the DeepMind people published on protein folding, where the best humans in the world for decades had tried to figure out how proteins would fold based on a DNA spec, and they never really got very close. And so despite that huge collaborative, even competitive effort, they weren't getting there. And then you took this artificial intelligence approach and showed it, what some folded proteins looked like, and very carefully constructed thing, and realized somehow that machine was able to understand, I'll put that in quotes, why do proteins fold the way they fold? And given another one, could then make a prediction. And, people generally think that that's now a solved problem, sort of in 2 iterations of that approach by the DeepMind people. And I think that that's just a harbinger of what's going to happen over and over and over again in almost every field of engineering and science. But if you look at most places, they're still stuck on the old path, which is, I'm just making this model so it can help me do something better. And I think, it's going to be critically important for people to make the leap to say, no, we now have to assemble our best and brightest in order to train that polymathic element of the machine such that it can actually do the integration in the high dimensional space that produces an answer that no human or small set of humans will be able to do themselves.
That's going to have some obviously profound implications for national defense as well. I would often encounter the discussion about AI, introducing AI to the battlefield, and often as the helper, the loyal wingman, the AI airplane that flies, but you still got the human, the human led aircraft.
And I personally, my view is it doesn't matter whether you're trying to solve a science problem, make a discovery somewhere, or are trying to go fly an airplane better. Each of these things is a high dimensional problem, and people have sort of reserved for humans the idea that, well, they can operate in these high dimensional spaces better. But in a world of high speed, high resolution data, humans are actually just I/O limited. The only high bandwidth input system we have is vision. And we don't have really a high bandwidth output system at all. And our vision system only deals at the conceptual level. So, like I'm very involved in biology and medicine. And, if I go up to you, Mark, and say, hey, I'd really like to, have you conclude some things. Here's my proteome. It's just a set of numbers, maybe, today it's 10,000 floating point numbers. All right, I'll give you those 10. It's only 10,000. That's tiny compared to your genome. All right, but hey, that's a good proxy for all of my physical systems. Please tell me if I'm going to have a heart attack next week. All right. Well, I mean, you'd stare at that and say, "Wow, man, I can't remember those 10,000 floating point numbers. How the hell can I figure that out?" The machine, on the other hand, happily ingests the 10,000 and many, many times that. It remembers every number, and the details of every number. And therefore, its ability to take where the details matter, the machine just has an inherent advantage over the human, both in speed and in accuracy. And so, it's these reasons that make me think that if you don't make this leap to thinking that, oh my God, I'm the trainer of that thing, it's not my wingman, all right, and once I've trained it, it's just going to be better than I am. Like, full stop, better. And so, you see examples of this, at least in the publicly reported stories of, the Air Force, doing dogfights with, jets flown by machine learning algorithms, and, they beat the aces every time. I mean, it's no different than, the machines beating people in Go or chess or checkers. I mean, it's just the game is getting more and more high dimensional. But in many of these cases, it's also got a lot of data that's got to be crunched in real time to know what the best thing to do is. And I think all of these things are just going to supersede what humans are good at. So from a defense point of view, mean, I know it's very difficult because, whether it's sort of ethics or philosophy, the question of, how do you trust the machine? I've got my own thoughts about how that ultimately has to go. But I think if you overly constrain your willingness to deploy these machines, whether it's in scientific discovery, operating your factory, or flying your airplane, you will lose because somebody else will not have that constraint.
So on a much more primitive level, I spent much of my research career on aerospace vehicle optimization, and you would often find, you present an objective function, you run an optimizer, and it will go in a design direction that the human would never have anticipated, to the point where you're looking at the design and scratching your head and saying, how did I come up with that? And then you trace back and realize, that's something that I never would have thought of, but this makes a lot of sense.
Well, and that's, in a sense, why I think one of the fundamental learnings, I'll say, in the high-scale AI world is the quicker you decide that the goal is to train the machine by letting it explore the high-dimensional space itself, and you facilitate that, as opposed to say, hey, no, I understand this space. I'm going to train you based on what the human understands, right? The sooner you let go of that, the more you make progress. I mean, when Google did the Go thing the first time, AlphaGo, it did what everybody thought was right. You looked at the world's best Go players and every recorded game they ever made, and you trained it, and pretty soon, by learning from all of them, it could beat any one of them. But then they actually did AlphaGo Zero, where they said, no, I'm just starting with the rules of the board, and then I'm going to let the machine play itself for a month. All right. And indeed, exactly that happened. It discovered ways to play Go that humans collectively in 3,000 years never found. All right. And then that thing beat the one that beat the humans 100-0. All right. So, I mean, it just it gives you an idea like, okay, how much was there to learn that humans never got around to? And oh, by the way, it did it in a month. And I think that whether it's Go or flying or chemistry or whatever it might be, this idea that, we talked about the limitations of our I/O. The other problem is, we have this pretty slow clock rate because, we're a carbon-based system. And so, you compare that to the silicon systems and you say, okay, I've got something like 10 to the 7th or 10 to the 8th difference in clock rate.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's fast. That's a lot of difference.
Yeah.
And so, if that turns out to be a factor of how quickly you can explore a high-dimensional space, then, it should be pretty obvious that the machine's going to try things in a relatively short time that humans never did.
Yeah.
And I just think these are sort of profound learnings over the last 3 or 4 years in the field of hyperscale AI that I don't think have permeated the way that most companies and probably the government think about this stuff.
Craig, I'm going to unfortunately let that be the last word because we're out of time for this segment. I could talk to you about this all day, alas, and maybe we can get you back on the podcast. Thank you so much for your insights and for your observations. I really enjoyed the conversation today.
Great. Well, it's fun being here, and I'm happy to talk again at some point.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.